Hello, and welcome to The Brief, a video podcast that explores vital issues and events in international affairs and brings you some perspective and analysis. I'm your host, Jim Clancy. The International Criminal Court issued two long-awaited arrest warrants for Israel's political and military leadership, accusing them of crimes against humanity and war crimes. But the carnage continues in Gaza, which has been obliterated by more than a year of relentless bombing and shelling, and now in Lebanon, with a huge swath of villages in the south emptied of residents. Israelis have been forced out of their homes too in the north, where scores of Hezbollah rockets continue to cause casualties. At the same time, we have watched the U.S. cast yet another veto in the UN Security Council, calling for a ceasefire in Gaza and the delivery of more humanitarian aid. Tens of thousands have been killed, many more wounded on all sides, in a conflict that refuses to be diffused. Joining us to discuss the many dimensions of this crisis, from Gaza to Lebanon and beyond, is Associate Professor of International Politics and a founding director of the program in Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut, Karim Makdisi. Also joining us in our discussion, Wissam Yafi, an activist and author focused on the Middle East from the Washington, D.C. area, as we look at crucial developments surrounding U.S. military support for Israel. Gentlemen, hello and welcome to The Brief.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim.
Professor Makdisi, let me begin with you. The news that the International Criminal Court was issuing arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant, does it change anything?
I think it does. I mean, it won't change anything for people in Gaza at the moment. It's not going to change anything for people in Lebanon at the moment. But I think it'll have, over the longer term, I think it has a real impact. Right now, neither Netanyahu nor Gallant can travel anywhere. They can be subject to arrest, basically, in any of the, I think it's 124, 125 member states of the ICC. So this is politically, symbolically, in terms of their legitimacy on the international stage, I think is very, very important, and gives another set of ammunition to say, no, we need to use international legal instruments to pursue this genocide, to pursue kind of accountability for the genocide that's taking place, for this incredibly illegal, unlawful, and terrible invasion of Lebanon that's taking place at the same time now. So I think it's important, but it's not going to have an immediate material impact. We've already seen that Netanyahu, as you might imagine, has already come out and said, this is anti-Semitic, this is, only against the Jewish state, and, the kind of things that you might expect. But I don't think anybody listens to him anymore. I think the whole world understands very clearly that what they're doing is basically genocide, war crimes for sure, crimes against humanity. And I think this issuance of finally, several months later, the ICC pretrial chamber issuing this warrants are very, very important.
Well, and let me go back, and people will say, well, what about Hamas? There were no arrest warrants for them, despite the fact that it would appear that the entire leadership has now been eliminated.
But there was an arrest to Mohammed Daif. There was also issued an arrest warrant. As for the other two, they were killed already. So you can't issue an arrest warrant for people that had already been killed. Remember, originally, in fact, it was a bit strange that the chief prosecutor had submitted, I think there were 5 overall authorization for arrest warrants. And those included 3 from Hamas leaders and only 2 Israelis, which was very strange. In either case, you only have Mohammed Daif is still alive today, and I think they did issue the arrest warrant for him as well.
Wissam, at the same time, you look at what's going on at the UN Security Council, and once again, the U.S. has stood up and said, no, Israel has a right to do all of this, and very importantly, it would seem, the U.S. has a right to help them.
Yeah, there seems to be some sort of a disconnect between the overall American, sentiment between the people and the administration. The administration insists on placing the United States almost on its own in the defense of Israel at a time when the rest of the world seems to be essentially have reached the conclusion that Karim had just mentioned, which is that there is something, totally wrong in what's going on. And latest polls coming out highlight that the American people actually are of the opinion that the U.S. should be taking much more of a reconciliatory position to end the war. So will this change now that the administration will be changing in January? That's an open question, but I think a lot of the people, particularly those, the Arab Americans, essentially voted for Trump, hoping that that would be the case.
Well, I don't have much hope on that front with the ascension, once again, of Donald Trump. But at the same time, I look at the Congress, and Senator Sanders was turned back once again with a resolution that said all we have to do is abide by our own set of values, that we say we cannot give weapons of war or sell armaments to countries that are violating basic humanitarian law. And there, it doesn't seem to make a difference.
100%. I think that is, not only do we have a disconnect in the United States with the people, there also seems to be a major disconnect with our own laws in the U.S., with the judiciary, as well as apparently the international law. And so, I was having a conversation yesterday with one of the policymakers, and I posed the question: Is Israel really worth it for us to kind of destroy the entire world order that has been built over almost a century in terms of the judiciary, the political systems, even what we at least claim that we stand for in the United States. And I think the question is becoming more and more apparent the higher the cost of this war. And genocide is not something to be trifled with. And as an American citizen and an activist, and it's painful to me to see that my administration at least has been complicit to genocide or alleged genocide, if we want to be politically correct.
Your views on that, Professor?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with Wissam. I think it's important to point out that what Sanders was trying to do, and I think there were maybe a dozen other senators that voted for that. I think there was around $20 billion. This was only about 5 or 10% of the most offensive weapons that they were trying to block. And even that, as you're saying, overwhelmingly, that was voted against. So the Biden administration, it was leaked that the Biden administration had been lobbying and pressuring and had talking points basically that had come from somewhere else, let's just say, to try to put the pressure on any senator that might have been a little bit hesitant. So they rammed this thing through. There have been, billions and billions and billions of dollars of weapons and surveillance equipment sent to the Israelis. It's very clear to anybody living in Lebanon, in Palestine, anywhere in the world, that with one word, the United States could have ended all of this. The Israelis are 100% dependent on U.S. weapons, on U.S. approval, surveillance, for everything else. And it's very clear that without these weapons being fast-tracked, and without the diplomatic support that the U.S. gives at the Security Council, I think we'll talk about this in a minute, it's very clear that the Israelis would have had to stop this a long time ago. It's interesting, you mentioned Bernie Sanders, and it's something that a lot of progressives were quite upset with him for many months. If you recall, even I think in December and January, he was still opposing a ceasefire in Gaza. And he, I think he missed the boat there. I think he totally misunderstood the way, in the direction that this genocide was going. He dismissed categorically a lot of the information, a lot of the evidence that people were giving him and hoping that he would champion. And instead he was one of the people who helped block any kind of ceasefire discussion. So he's come to it quite late. He still doesn't call it genocide, of course, but at least he's coming to this quite late. But it's better late than never in this sense. But it's just too bad that it's coming at the very end of a Democratic administration and the entry now of a totally new world with Trump and some of these very bizarre people that he's appointed.
Gentlemen, let's take the broader view. It would seem that the U.S. and Iran are involved in this bitter and destructive proxy war. And that is that the U.S. is supplying its proxy, Israel, with all the weapons it needs to try to take Iran down a notch. Iran has always wanted a seat at the table in the Middle East, to be recognized as such. I'm not sure that they're committed to the Palestinians, as they say. I know they're committed to the Palestinian card that they want to play in order to win that seat at the table. Your thoughts? Professor, go first.
Yeah, I think both of what you're saying, both of your statements are correct. On the one hand, Iran has been, I mean, it's not a secret, it's their claimed stance that they want to have a seat in the table. They are a big regional power, and they need to be, eventually, one way or the other, they need to be recognized as one of these regional powers, along with Saudi Arabia, along with Turkey. There's several large states that need to be recognized as part of the order within the Middle East. So that needs to happen. And what's happened over the past 2 or 3 decades has been various administrations that have been trying to isolate Iran, mostly on behalf of the Israelis, to try to kind of push forward an Israeli-led regional order that would now include the Gulf, so Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf countries, to the exclusion of Iran. So that's been happening. The one administration that went against us a little bit was the Obama administration when they did this nuclear deal. And the first thing that Trump did when he came in 2016 was he reversed it and changed it. And then Biden said he would also not pursue any kind of deal with Iran as well. So yes, they want a seat on the table. They've been very clear about this, and I think that will remain for the coming weeks and months and years. But it does not mean that it's also not genuine in the sense of being part of this larger axis of resistance to try to champion the Palestinians and the Palestinian cause. It doesn't mean that that's the only thing, that it's being totally selfless, that there's nothing else on its agenda, that it doesn't have its own interest. Of course it does. But these interests coincide together. And it's a way to mobilize a lot of popular support across the region, across the Arab region, across the Middle East, across the larger kind of Islamic world, across the larger global South, one could even say. And so they have spent the last 10, 15 years kind of building up this axis of resistance, supplying it with weapons, making sure that the connections, the networks, the infrastructure were in place. On the other hand, I think that they saw, as you're saying, an opportunity to try to break Iran and break this axis of resistance, which would in turn, in a kind of larger dimension, as they see it, restrict perhaps China and Russia to an extent in the region. So this kind of slightly larger international politics that they are gambling with. And when you're talking about gambling, we're talking about the lives of hundreds of thousands of, or if not millions of people in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Sudan, and across the region. So it's a very, very dangerous time. And it's a very big, I would say, sort of gamble by the United States, which is not going to pay off. Hezbollah is not going to go anywhere. Iran is not going to go anywhere.
Wissam, let me put this to you. We've always seen the threat of the wider war. Well, why hasn't Iran, or Israel for that matter, really made it a wider war, which both are capable of doing, an all-out war?
Well, I think Israel has to a certain degree, but Iran hasn't. And I think from a strategic perspective, Iran seems to have the edge at the moment because all the costs are being borne by Israel, economic, political, you just you name it. Israel is really paying a very, very hefty price. From an Iranian perspective, the price it's paying has been minimal. There's a couple of things I would add to what Karim mentioned from an Iranian perspective. I think the first is that from an Iranian foreign policy perspective, it also helps its internal dynamics. You may recall over the past couple of years, Iran has had its internal instability. And so when all eyes are focused on regional issues, Iran kind of, its domestic agenda kind of takes almost a backstage, and there's that instability sort of fades. That's from one perspective that plays into Iran's favor. The other things that are playing in Iran's favor, I think, are the fact that from a strategic perspective, it's basically getting everything that it wants. It is seen right now as the power, the regional power that has stood up to a probable genocide. And so from that perspective, strategically, its leaders aren't being indicted in the ICC. It's not being, dragged through the ICJ for probable genocide. Its economy hasn't been paying or having to, recruit hundreds of thousands of soldiers, taking away from economic activity and all that kind of stuff.
Do we really think that Iran is winning when we look at Gaza, when we look at southern Lebanon, when we look at the casualties, when we look at the suffering of people?
Yeah, your original question, I guess, stands in this case. Is Iran just using these different regional hotspots as pawns in its overall strategic war? And if we assume that, if we go ahead and assume that, then in that case, one could make the argument that Iran is certainly, might be winning or certainly not losing. So from that perspective, now one could take the longer view, which is, okay, what's going to happen in the war in Lebanon? You might want to cover this in a couple of minutes, which is, what if Hezbollah's, power is reduced, assuming that happens? Is that going to take away from Iran's, a position, regional position? So, and I have question marks around that. But I will say the following as well. Keep in mind, from a foreign policy perspective, Iran's rapprochement with Saudi Arabia is a major, major win for Iran, and a major loss for Israel. Right before October 7th, if you recall, Jim, Israel was kind of, and Netanyahu were on the UN, podium, kind of showing off his vision of a new Middle East and all that stuff. And lo and behold, and of course they were betting on a kind of like a relationship being established with Saudi Arabia. If you heard Turki Faisal just a couple of days ago here in DC, that's off the table. That's gone. That's history. So the only option right now for any type of Arab rapprochement by, or some sort of a peace deal has to go through Palestine. That was not the case on October 7th.
Well, Professor Makdisi, it would appear that Wissam thinks that, Iran is willing to fight until the last Palestinian.
Yeah. Yes, that's how it's viewed by many, I would say, in the West, and probably some in Lebanon and others. This notion that, I think Wissam outlined strategically quite correctly. Iran, so far, depending on how things end, I think strategically is not losing at all. I think the Israelis are strategically losing now vis-a-vis Iran. If you widen up a little bit and go to your original question about Lebanon, the Palestinians, Gaza, the suffering at the human level is immense. We can't do it justice here. We all see it. It's in Gaza. It's the first genocide that is live streamed, so we all see it on a 24-hour day basis. The Israeli soldiers put their stuff on TikTok. It's really rather extraordinary. So the level of devastation is extraordinary. What will happen to people in Gaza is unknown, but it's still, as we speak, they're still ethnically cleansing parts of the northern parts of Gaza and preparing, I think, for a plan where they want to ethnically cleanse the entire population outside. We'll see what's going to happen. I think it's really important, though, to remember that if the Israelis are unable to achieve their objectives and eventually they're forced into a ceasefire, then you can begin to see at least some basic path for the region. If the Israelis are allowed to continue, and if they win somehow, if they continue to win, if they were to, let's say, take over Lebanon, which they're not going to do, they can barely get through the first 5 kilometers of southern Lebanon. If they can ethnically cleanse everybody in Gaza, which they've not been able to do, if they can get the Americans to attack, invade Iran and destroy the entire nuclear thing, which they've not been able to do, and I don't think they will do, then that's something. But I don't think they're going to do this. I think Netanyahu is going to be in huge trouble. I think domestically, Israeli society is going to become more split. I think there's going to be they're going to have a lot of trauma. There's a lot of PTSD. There's going to be a lot of bickering. The internal fighting that was taking place before October 7th is going to resume much more so. From what we can see, there have been about 1 million Israelis that have left Israel over the past year, mostly these kind of liberal types. It's going to become more religious. It's going to become more fundamentalist. They're going to, with Trump in power, they're going to try to push for the West Bank, for the annexation of parts of the West Bank. So this is going to continue. What Israel represents to America, to the world, is nothing but let's say, violence and instability and genocide. This is in a sense what Israel represents. It's extremely important what Wissam is saying, which is that strategically, it's important that Israel not achieve what it wants. And I think the confusion is that I don't think the Israelis know what their strategy is, and this is part of the issue. Killing people, committing genocide, invading Lebanon. All these are not strategic goals. These are just impulsive things. These are things you try to inflict violence, you try to inflict terror on people, but these are not strategies. It's very difficult to understand what the Israeli strategy is, except for the kind of final endpoint, which is kind of ethnic cleansing in the entire region. That's not going to work. That's simply not going to work. And as Wissam said, a year ago in October of 2023, there was no Palestine. Palestine was considered to be completely out of it. There was going to be very imminently a Saudi-Israeli normalization deal. And this is now off the table for now. I don't know if it's permanently off the table, but it's off the table at least for now, until the genocide is over, until there's a ceasefire in Lebanon, and until there's some kind of something that goes on in terms of negotiating with Palestine.
So, Wissam, how does this unravel?
I think it all comes back to Washington, D.C. to a certain degree, because you would have wished it to be kind of handled within each nation and somehow through its own systems and democracy and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's all gone. That there's no possibility for that right now. So at this point, in my mind at least, the only player that seems to be blocking any true change towards, back towards the train tracks of peace, if you will, is the U.S. It's the only nation that can do that. And the reason for this is because I think Karim is right. Israel has taken a route that I think most of the West, I would argue, had not signed up for. I go back to the first thing I was saying, which is the United States. We're the only nation right now that is in full support of Israel, and taking out this support means Israel essentially would be on its own and would have to change its course. If we keep supporting Israel,
that's all true. That's true, how much power that the U.S. has, but are they going to wield it? And with Donald J. Trump coming into office, doesn't seem like anything's going to change soon.
It's a big question mark. On the one hand, Donald Trump's policies, we all know, are pretty haphazard and not quite, they don't go really, near as deep as one would hope. But on the other hand, he's also somehow, maybe counterintuitively to his domestic agenda, which is a very kind of combative agenda. On the international scene, he's actually wanted to kind of pull back from NATO. He's called for stopping the war between Ukraine and Russia. He's made some promises on the Middle East, on the one hand, right? On the other hand, the appointments, as Karim pointed out a few minutes ago, have not been very promising. They've been quite hawkish.
Professor Makdisi, your thoughts about this incoming administration, what difference it will make?
There might be this push towards getting ceasefires sooner or later, because as Wissam is saying, he campaigned on this idea of he's going to bring peace agreements to everywhere. So I think that might happen, because anyway, it's coming. We're coming to the end. I mean, Biden is associated and Blinken and his administration are associated with genocide. They're associated with the invasion, this incredible destruction of Lebanon as we're seeing it now. So I'm not sure Trump necessarily needs that for his credentials. It's much easier for him to come and say, okay, we're coming to the end. Let's get to these ceasefires. There are negotiations taking place now. Let's see how this, what happens in the next few weeks.
So he has literally told the Israelis, let's finish it. Just finish it and be done with it.
Yeah,
now, that has serious repercussions for the Palestinians.
Yeah, of course it does. But people keep saying he's going to be worse than Biden. We keep saying, but Biden is enabled and supported a genocide. So it's difficult to understand the logic of he's going to be worse. Now, what will happen? What's going to be worse is going to be the other side of this. So I think he might, and again, I'm not saying he will, but he might push for this kind of ceasefire in terms of just creating a certain stability, because that allows his ego and himself to be able to enter stage. If there's war, he doesn't have much, he's not a role, he's not a military guy, he doesn't know what to do. If there's this kind of wheeling, dealing business, I can get the deal done and I can get Ukraine done, and he enjoys that. He can get the Saudis back on track with the Israelis. That's something where he personally likes to do. And he's a narcissist, and this is what he likes to do. The problem, the flip side of the genocide that Biden and his people have been pushing is the question of the West Bank and the question of the annexation. So you might sort of be finishing up in the sense of the war itself, the genocide itself, but you're going to be flipping towards people that are going to push big time to ethnically cleansing in the West Bank. and then the annexation. Remember, Trump is the one who accepted the annexation of the Golan Heights in Syria, which, by the way, Biden kept. So it's Trump that did it, and East Jerusalem, but Biden accepted that. Basically, he did not reverse it. He continued with the Trump policy, both in terms of the Golan Heights and in terms of East Jerusalem. What I think Trump is going to do, what he's going to allow as a concession, in a sense, for all the donors and all the people that basically supported his campaign, is he's putting all these kinds of crazy Christian Zionists in places, the ambassador, others, to try to push this West Bank, what's going to be pogroms in the West Bank. They're going to start pushing, but it won't necessarily be in this one major genocidal act that's taking place now, but more in a kind of daily, weekly, as we're already seeing. It's already started. But that might escalate, and there's going to be more death, more damage, more pushing in places like Hebron and other places, more pushing at Palestinians. There's going to be more Israeli army involvement, direct involvement, as they're already doing with the settlers. There's going to be more settlers on the rampage. And the question is, will Trump and will the American administration continue to support that? I think they will. I think that's the part where the Biden administration and the Europeans, to an extent, did not want, we're telling the Israelis, you can't go there. Because the Europeans in particular, and the Democrats to a certain extent, had put their eggs a little bit into the Palestinian Authority basket. They need something symbolic. The Palestinian Authority is an appendage to the Israeli occupation. We all know that. It's controlled by the Americans and the Israelis, and the Jordanians to an extent. They have security that's trained by the Jordanians, the Israelis, and the Americans as internal police to try to stop any kind of demonstrations against the Israelis themselves. But they still need that as a symbolic presence. They need this Palestinian Authority. As far as the Republicans are concerned, as far as Trump is concerned, as far as Netanyahu and the Israelis are concerned, they don't need this. They don't need that kind of Palestinian Authority. So the West Bank represents this kind of Palestinian Authority as opposed to Hamas. More difficult to try to play with politically and symbolically. But these guys are not going to care about that. So they're going to push along that line. That's my fear in terms of the Palestine equation.
When I look at it, I see nothing but losers all across the board. The U.S. has lost. I think Iran has lost. Certainly the utter devastation of Gaza and what's happened in South Lebanon, the way that hundreds of thousands, millions of people have been pushed out of their homes, just the wanton destruction that we have seen brings up a catastrophe whose ferocity, frankly, I haven't witnessed in my lifetime, looking at something like that. That's particularly here in this theater in the Middle East. But Wissam, a lot of people, they looked, at places like near where you are right now, near Washington, D.C., and they said, well, one thing has arisen from this, and that is the young people standing up on college campuses, voicing their own opposition to genocide, to what's happened with the Palestinians. But it seems to be becoming a little more difficult by the day in the U.S. Your perspective?
Definitely. And I think, the university movement and just people in general. I mean, the university movement has certainly been out there and it's kind of brought to the fore a lot of things that were happening behind the scenes in a very grotesque manner. I mean, it's when you see campuses of quite liberal universities, clamp down on students in such a way. That's shameful for the United States in general, and the Western liberal kind of idea, if you will, in general. But it's placed a huge question mark of who's running what, and I think that has had, that was kind of became very obvious in the media, and that has had, I think, an effect on people's perceptions, and so. Earlier in this conversation, we kind of discussed the movement of the, there's an American kind of change in sentiment in terms of overall, the role of the U.S., how it should be played in Israel, but also the idea of Israel itself, within the overall kind of a Middle East. So I think there's going to be a lot of introspection happening over the next few years. The U.S. administration might go in completely different directions from this sentiment, that, most certainly
but to
the
the
youth
point,
themselves are not going to accept it very easily. Go ahead.
Where are the young people going? Okay, we talked about inside the U.S. They're facing a lot of pressure. You see another perspective from your seat there in Paris.
Yeah, I'm in Paris now temporarily. It's just to add to what we said. I think the question of younger generation in America is going to be very important. We saw student protests across the world, but in the U.S., in Europe as well, but in the U.S. it was very, very dramatic, and the clampdown was even more dramatic. So you have a very clear generational shift. The kind of Biden generation simply needs to exit politics. They just need to go. It's an old, tired generation that's working within the politics, and that has that hasn't understood the way the global politics is going. They're going to be inherited by this younger generation that are now coming of age with seeing a genocide live streamed. So when people say, well, aren't there massacres? There's hellholes in places like Sudan and Yemen, and and across the world, there's incredible situations going on. Why Palestine? Why do even, I'm not talking about Arab Americans, we're talking about just, Americans across the board, no matter their ethnicity or color or whatever it is. There's something about Palestine that draws people in because it represents, on the one hand, this kind of a very long anti-colonial movement for justice and for freedom and for independence and self-determination, very, very old, decades old, and so it's well known. On the other hand, it's something that the United States is directly enabling. So whether it's genocide or occupation or any of the infrastructure of the occupation or ethnic cleansing mechanisms that are taking place. So the U.S. is directly involved, as are the Europeans directly involved. So this coming together with students that are between the ages of 16 and 25 or so in this age group, they're seeing it live streamed. So you can't come up with the mainstream news and tell them, oh, this is happening. No, they can see it. They've got their TikToks, they've got their social media, they've got their own networks, they've got so things are they understand what's going on, and they can see that their politicians are lying to them, and they can see that their political system is blocking things. If you're a young person and you saw what happened yesterday, which is the United States vetoing for the fourth time a Security Council draft on an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Now, we're talking 14, 15 months after the genocide starts. And they're still casting a veto when even the UK, its staunchest ally, voted in favor, didn't even abstain, voted in favor, as did France, as did all the other 14 members on the Security Council. So the US comes up and says, no, if you're a young student or a young person and you're looking at this, you understand that you're on the wrong side of history. And you understand when you then see your senators and your congresspeople voting to send even more arms, even as the International Criminal Court is indicting these people for genocide, even as the International Court of Justice is considering a case of genocide within the Genocide Convention, even as the International Court of Justice has just ruled on the occupation. You see all of these things. You see the global protests. You see songs. You see artists. You see poems. You see everything. All of this stuff is all over the place. And you see your politicians acting in a certain way. By the way, as a professor, you see your university administrators cracking down. So you see that at the very top, almost exclusively, you see that all the university administrations going with those in power, calling in the police, testifying in Congress against their own students, allowing police onto their own campuses, coming up with unbelievably, as an academic, as a professor, the very fabric of the American educational system, the freedom of speech, the freedom to protest, freedom to say what you want, within certain limits, but the general freedom. This is being taken away by the universities themselves, who are serving the donors and the funders that are pressuring them, and the Congress that also want to take away the funding. So this is going on. If you're a student, if you're a person, you see this. It is an extremely dangerous trend. And I think as these people filter into local, perhaps first local and then filter their way up into the national scene, things are going to change. And as I said earlier, the Israelis, if there's one thing that we've understood over the past year, is that Israel cannot defend itself. Israel requires the United States to survive, not just to survive, but also to continue its ethnic cleansing campaigns, to continue its genocide, to continue its occupation. Without the United States and countries like Germany and the UK, to a lesser extent, without these countries, the Israelis would have to fold into an order, an international regional order that's based on, nobody's saying there's perfection, but at least based on the minimal standards of, laws and ways of dealing with people and with other states in the neighborhood. One last point, because it's something Wissam mentioned, I think it's important to differentiate, because this is what young people are talking about. It's what many of us have talked about. But now it's interesting that this discourse has changed. You can talk now, unlike when I was a student, now in America and places, you can talk about Israel as an apartheid state. You can talk about genocide. You talk about occupation. You can talk about war criminals now that Netanyahu and Gallant and these people have been indicted. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, it's quite clear that there is this sense of that Zionism itself is at the root. So it's not a question of the state itself. It's a question of the political ideology, which is Zionism, which is an ethno-nationalist movement that wants to put itself into a state in which there are non-Jews that lived to now. I'm not even talking about 1947 and 1948, where the state of Israel was born on a genocide of the Nakba of 1948. We're talking about, to this day, 20-25% of the population inside Israel itself is non-Jewish. And yet there's an apartheid situation where they are considered second and third class citizens. That's not this ethno-nationalist and therefore then expansionist ideology that is embodied in Zionism cannot remain. It either has to win completely, and that means total genocide, total ethnic cleansing of Palestine, Palestinians totally and completely 100%, inside 48, in the West Bank and in Gaza. And it also means the expansionist part of the Israelis, of Zionism, which is Lebanon, Syria, going back to reconquer the Sinai, and other areas like that. It requires that. Anything that pushes back on that has to be within this kind of anti-Zionist framework. And that's very important.
Yeah, Jim, would you allow me to add one thing which is very important here? There's a stark contrast between the Lebanese model, as problematic as it's been to a lot of Lebanese, and I'm a Lebanese American, and the Israeli model. You mentioned a short while ago, for example, Iran's influence on a group within Lebanon. Interestingly enough, Hezbollah, of course. Interestingly enough, they recognized the importance of the this religious diversity that exists in Lebanon, and no single Lebanese group, as I'm talking, as a nation, but groups within the nation, has ever tried to impose any religious or ethno-religious on the other. They've sort of tried to kind of fend for themselves, and in certain cases, we did have the civil war, etc. But the reasoning behind this was never to really kind of ethnically cleanse another within the nation, so that there's this ethno kind of a model. Contrast this to the Israeli model, which is really kind of was born based on this Zionist approach, which is, it's got to be a Jewish state, and anybody else is
which is European,
etc.
Sorry, Wissam, add that Zionism, of course, it's a European approach. That's why it's not indigenous to the region.
Correct. And so contrast those two models, and this is why as people from the region themselves are kind of looking at this, and they're saying there's something seriously wrong here. One society that has been offered peace, by all Arab nations, or if not all Muslim nations, is rejecting it based on a certain ideology, which is ethno-religious. And at the same time, you have some other countries in the region struggling, like Lebanon, for example, that have not tried to do that. And yet they're seen, as the aggressor, or they were seen as the aggressor for a while, the terrorists or whatever names they were being called. There's something, there's a value system here that people are starting to revisit. I think it's much more clear for the young people, right, to kind of clearly say, see this and say there's something wrong with this model over here, as opposed to some of the other models that are a little bit more accommodating. And this is one of the biggest losses for Israel.
Gentlemen, young people are calling reality check on the history of the region. What really happened here? But there's other kinds of reality checks we can't forget about. There is a portion of the Lebanese citizenry that really feels held hostage by Hezbollah, a political party and militia that makes its own decision about when to go to war and when to drag the country into that. People are being made to pay the price for that. But for years we have existed with the idea that Hamas has its missiles and rockets. Hezbollah has even more powerful missiles. They're putting pressure on Israel. Israel has, the most advanced air force anywhere in the Middle East, and they have the backing of U.S. arms and expertise. Let's face it. But all of those things have only resulted, from what I see, from my perspective, in the utter devastation of entire regions. That what's been adopted is just a scorched earth policy, where we either do it my way or you cease to exist, or the life you know ceases to exist. And it's a pretty depressing point in time.
I hear what you're saying, and of course it's bleak. It's very difficult to be optimistic no matter where you stand on this. But I would say this, I think it continues from what Wissam was saying and what I was saying a little bit earlier. You have two models ahead of you. You have a model based on Palestine and Palestinian, what it represents. I'm not talking about the petty politics of, the sort of the nitty-gritty politics. We're talking about what Palestine represents, which is why it has the global appeal that it does. No other country, no other struggle has the appeal that Palestine does. That's the reality. Because of what it represents. If you look at the question of Palestine from day one, and this includes when during the PLO phase, it includes all the decades since then, Palestine has always represented this kind of larger, inclusive model. I mean, maybe your audience forgets that Palestinians are also Christians. And there were, of course, Palestinian Jews, and of course there's Palestinian Muslims. Lebanon as well. We have, 18, 20, whatever they are, ethnic, religious groups inside Lebanon. The models that are presented in that sub-region, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, these countries, is an inclusivist one. It is not one that's built on genocide. It is not one that's built on ethnic cleansing. Whereas Zionism, which comes from an Eastern European context, from Poland and Ukraine and these kinds of countries, they came to Palestine and created a reality in which it needed, by definition, to create an ethnically homogeneous, pure state, and that is the Jewish state. The way it implemented it was through conquest, through war and conquest, first using the British and then using the Americans over many, many decades. At each of these phases, they created a monster. There was the whatever it was early on. Then there was the PLO. Then there was Abdel Nasser. Then there was, the Iranians. Then Hezbollah. Then Hamas. So each time they create a new monster so that they can say, look, these people are out to get us. We need to arm more. We need to go more. We need to get rid of them. We need to kill them. We need, But we are the ones who are the victims in this case. It's simply all this stuff doesn't stack up. You need a historical context to understand that Hezbollah came out of an Israeli occupation, multiple invasions and occupation, rather than the other way around. So before that, the Israelis said, well, we're attacking the Palestinians in Lebanon. Well, okay, the Palestinians were in Lebanon because the Israelis had cleansed them from their areas. So, we can go into these cycles and one can keep on blaming the victim and saying, you're not allowed to do anything. You're not allowed to defend yourself. You're not allowed to resist. You can't do anything. You have to accept. I think I'm actually going to quote yesterday what the Palestine deputy ambassador said at the Security Council when he gave his speech after the United States had issued its veto in the Gaza ceasefire. He says that at the end, he says, is there a UN charter for Israel that is different from the charter we all have? Tell us. Is there an international law for them and an international law for us? And this is the most important part. Do they have the right to kill? And the only right we have is to die. So, I think this, it's something which is very important. The idea of life and death, we're not even talking about at the level of UN charter and international law, but the idea that the Israelis have a continuous right over decades to kill and kill and kill, an industrial level kind of murder and ethnic cleansing. And they say it We don't need, this is not like some smart analysis I'm coming up with. They say it. I mean, you can find their quotes, their ministers, their officials, their members of parliament who literally say this, and much worse than what I'm saying. And they call them cockroaches and animals and all this kind of thing that we've heard over the past year and over many decades. They have this right to kill, and Palestinians have the right to die. So this is a model that needs to be flipped on its head. It cannot be acceptable. People in the region want to live in peace, not with Zionism. They will not live in peace with Zionism. The idea of living with Jews and Muslims, that is absolutely indigenous to what we are, to what we represent. Anybody, my parents' generation, my mother, comes from Palestine. She grew up in Egypt. She moved to Lebanon. There were, all that generation. There was Jews in schools and things. It was not an issue. There was never an issue. If you look at our history, that issue of Jewish, Muslim, Christian thing, that wasn't an issue in our part of the world. That came to be an issue when Zionism arrived from a European context, from a horrible European context, to be sure, an absolutely horrible European context. But it comes from a European history. And the result of that European history is to try to impose a homogenist, exclusivist model into our region. And they've been trying to do this with as much land as possible and as few people on this land as possible since 1947 onwards. It's not sustainable. It cannot work. So the discussion of Iran, we need to have it. The discussion what the Lebanese are thinking in terms of Hezbollah in Iran, that is a discussion we need to have. But it's separate from, it is not related to what Zionism is about, what Zionism has done, and what's going on inside Palestine. I think these are two different conversations that are equally important.
I look at the devastation of Gaza. Look at the devastation of the press corps, people trying to record what's going on there. I look at the attacks on medical facilities, as well as individual doctors, their imprisonment, tortures, and death. And I see an unprecedented conflict here. And like so many others, I'm at a loss to say how this is going to unwind. I'm at a loss to really have a perspective that says, well, don't worry, because we're going to solve this. What hope do you two have to offer anyone listening today? Just very briefly, Wissam?
My only hope, and I hate, I hate to put it in this context, but my only hope is that the United States rises to its level of responsibility. And I'm not sure this is going to happen because of all the internal politics that we have here in the U.S. But I would be hopeful because usually when things turn this bad, the old adage goes like, it can't get any worse, and so things should get better. But within the context of the Middle East, it could get worse before it gets better. But at some point or another, everyone is going to reach the conclusion that the way of the gun is not the way to go about it. And the best way to go about it is through peace. And so, a lasting peace, which everybody was hopeful Oslo, would be the first, stepping stone, I guess, towards. Unfortunately, it didn't yield, but that doesn't mean peace was the bad idea. It's the bad actors that essentially reversed that with some assassinations that happened, and we know the story. So I am hopeful. I am hopeful. Yeah. But the U.S. has to assert itself.
So you say U.S. leadership,
100%.
U.S. leadership can lift up the hopes that we have for this region. Professor Makdisi.
No, I have no hope in U.S. leadership. My hope is only in people. The hope is, we talked about students, we've talked about this younger generation. I think these are the people, whether it's in the U.S. or outside the U.S., that are going to push a new understanding. That have, as I said, they've seen what's going on in Gaza. They've seen a genocide live stream on their phones. They can't be told that this has not happened. They can't be played games by the New York Times and CNN and all these other mainstream kind of media that really helped enable and cover up a lot of what's going on in Gaza and Palestine and Lebanon. They see it. So my hope is with them. It's going to take a while, but they can latch on to new instruments, new kinds of forms of protest, and new kinds of institutions. We saw today that if the ICC has now just issued these warrants, well, we saw now already from, as I'm looking, Switzerland and France and I think Holland and other countries have accepted this ruling, meaning that if Netanyahu or Gallant come to Holland or if they go to France, they will be arrested upon arrival. You're going to see civil society, you're going to see people who are going to push that. They're going to be monitoring these people. If Netanyahu was to do a secret trip on a weekend trip somewhere to Amsterdam, people are going to show up at the airport and they're going to bring the police with them. There's going to be, I think, court cases across Europe, across countries like this, that are going to bring war crimes, even if states themselves are against it, even if the big states oppose it. People are going to push it from the bottom up through courts, through public pressure, through electing more sane people that don't support genocide, people whose whole political career is not simply up to one or two billionaire or trillionaire owners and donors. I think this is where the hope is. As far as the hope in our region is concerned, it's got to be with people that understand that obviously violence and death is not the way forward. You have to have, I wouldn't say, Wissam used the word peace. I know what he's saying. I say peace is the result of kind of justice and liberation. You can't have a peace that's between states in which people don't receive their justice. And I don't mean some kind of cosmic justice of retribution, stuff like that. Justice meaning, for example, the question of Palestine, the Palestine cause is a just question. It's something where you want people to have equal rights across historic Palestine. They need to have equal rights. They need to have a future. They need to have self-determination. They need to be able to be equal to everybody else and have equal opportunity. This has to be done through a political arrangement, not one that's cynically done where Palestine, for example, is the byproduct of a Saudi, Israeli, American, I don't know what, Russian, Iranian kind of deal, but something in which Palestinians feel they are part of and not inferior to Jewish Israelis. The same is true in Lebanon, same is true in all these countries. But I think the hope is with people and definitely never with states. Never. And certainly not with the United States government.
I want to thank you both for joining me. We've gone on pretty long. I do appreciate your heartfelt thoughts on all of this. Hopes for peace and hopes for people. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
And thank you for joining us. Please explore many of our other episodes of the Brief Podcast. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Give us a like or subscribe. For a complete listing, you can find more information at thebriefpodcast.org. Thanks. I'm Jim Clancy, and you've been briefed.